Good morning and welcome to the final day of Creating Pathways and Building Community. We are delighted to have you with us for our final day, but also probably one of the most exciting days for several of us to have with us just tremendous resources to talk to us and share with us. Hopefully throughout the last few days, you've had a chance to meet somebody new, make connections and find ways to help your own learning and understanding. That's one of the best things about the Community Foundation field. And hopefully you've enjoyed the conference. This morning I woke up and as I turned on the radio and it was public radio station, I heard about a bipartisan commission that had been created to look at the events that took place at the Capitol. And immediately the next voice was yelling in the background from one particular congressman. And it just got me thinking that once again, it's evidence of this extreme polarization that exists in our country today. And the challenges that we face as communities, as community foundations, trying to bring people together. And for the past 20 years that I've had the privilege to be in the community foundation field, I've always felt that there was a glimmer of hope when I would hear Dr. Robert Putnam speak, because he talked about how we could find pathways that maybe our hope was that we can find ways to bridge the divide that separate us. And if we can do that, that so many good things can happen in our local communities. So we were absolutely thrilled when we reached out and were fortunate to invite Dr. Putnam to be a part of this conference, and he and his co-author, Shaylyn, Romney, Garrett, said yes. They have a new book out called The Upswing. It's a great read, and here's our promo. Please pick it up, and it's a wonderful resource, especially for community foundations. But today we have them here live. Their bios are on our website, so we'll let you read through the wonderful qualifications of both of them. And we are just thrilled and excited to welcome them here virtually. And we'd like to turn it over to them now. So Dr. Putnam, but he likes to be called Bob. So Bob, thank you so much for being here. We're going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve. As you know, and many of your participants, I hope will know, I've spent a lot of time in Minnesota over the last 20, 25 years, really all over the state, and mostly talking to community foundation leaders and activists and donors. So I have a lot of interest in and a little bit of knowledge actually about the challenges that are facing folks in Minnesota. And I've not been able to take part in or watch all of the this conference, but I have watched, both Shaylyn and I have actually been able to watch some of the opening plenary sessions and panel discussion. And it was actually quite inspiring. In particular, Neil Kashkari, who is the head of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve branch. I hope you all know there, he's a national star, not just a local star. He knows a lot about Minnesota, but he's a nationally important person. So I feel Shaylyn and I are both very grateful for being allowed to participate in your conversation about how to improve things in Minnesota. So if we can have Carol, I think you're gonna go. Yeah, great. Hey, look at that. It works. Shaylyn and I are going to be talking about, well, let me step back a little bit first. We know, indeed the whole world knows, the challenges that Minneapolis and Minnesota have faced over the last year and even over the last month or so. The whole world knows about that. And we know about the importance of race in particular in Minnesota and of course all over the country, but the whole country's been focused on the George Floyd murder and the aftermath, including the most recent aftermath. And Shaylyn and I are going to actually come down at the end of this and at the end of our presentation and talk about the challenges of race today, and even maybe say a little bit about the challenges of race today in Minnesota. But I think the thing we can contribute to the conversation today is to sweep way back, zoom way back. I'm a photographer, so I think about zooming way back, not focusing on this time and this place, but looking at a much wider frame nationally and over time. And then we're going to start off by talking about that wider frame, and then we're going to narrow down to the things that interest you and concern you and us day by day. So if we can have the next slide, please. This is the good. This is our starting point. America today is, my mom would say, America's in a pickle. We have very high levels of political polarization. Steve alluded to that earlier, but we're probably about as polarized as America has ever been. And independently of that, we're also facing extreme high levels of economic inequality. And in addition, extremely high levels of social isolation and social fragmentation. And finally, extreme focus, cultural focus on self-centeredness. We're very much in a period in our history in which we're very much focused on what's in it for me and I. And so the first question we want to ask is, how did we get here? And then the second question we want to ask is, well, what does that history lesson tell us about the opportunities facing us right now? I'm going to talk mostly about the first. Shaylyn's going to talk more about the second. And I'm going to begin with some data, because I'm a data guy. And I want to show you a series of graphs that will illustrate what this first chart says, namely the high levels of polarization and inequality and isolation and self-centeredness that we find ourselves in today. So we have the next slide. If you don't like numbers, that's fine. Just close your eyes and nod off a little bit, but I'll be describing in words what the charts show. So now we're going to look first at politics, how polarized we are in any given period of the last 125 years, roughly speaking. And all the charts have this same format. There are not a lot of them. There are 5 or 6 charts that I'm going to be showing, but they all have this same format. The horizontal axis, you can see there, from left to right, starts at the end of the 19th century, about 125 years ago, and then goes across to today. And the vertical axis is some measure of how American society is fit together. In this case, a measure of political polarization. Up is the good version of that is comedy, getting along. Bipartisanship is up and polarization is down. And therefore you can see over at the lower left-hand corner of this chart, America in the 1890s was extremely polarized. That's not well known now, but America at the end of the 19th century was very divided. We had a kind of a tribal politics and very little cooperation between Republicans and Democrats. And people were so upset about that, actually, that in that period, there were a lot of third parties that arose, the Populist Party and the Bull Moose Party and so on. And that reflected the fact that America's party politics was so polarized that many voters just said none of the above, please. So you can see at the beginning as we entered the 20th century, American politics was extremely polarized. But then in the early years of the 20th century, we began to become more cooperative across party lines. And as you can see, that line rises through the 20s and through the 40s, through the 30s and 40s and into the 50s. And you can, if you pause just at the middle of the 50s, the high peak in which Americans were mostly not polarized in party lines, a lot of cross-party collaboration in those years that was symbolized by the president at that period, Dwight Eisenhower, who was president throughout most of the 50s. And Eisenhower was the least partisan president, except for George Washington, the least partisan president in American history. He could have been nominated by either party, and he himself actually thought there was not that much difference between the political parties. But then as you see, as we entered the 60s, that began to change, and suddenly we began to become a little more polarized politically. And that accelerated in the 70s and 80s and 90s and all the way down to where we are now. And actually, if we had the data, we have more recent data that aren't in this chart. That trend just keeps going down and down and down. And by 2020, by 2021, we're off the bottom of the chart. America is now what the one of the lessons is. We're probably as polarized politically as America has ever been in our entire history, with the single exception of 1860 to 1865. Think about that. Today, we are as polarized as American politics has been in our entire history, with the possible exception of the Civil War, for goodness sakes. Okay, that means, among other things, it means that we're now back in a situation in the 2020s. We're back in a situation very much like the 1890s. Now let's go to the next slide, which is about economics. And here we're going to be looking at the same basic kind of chart. How equal or unequal has been the distribution of income and wealth and opportunity in America. All these charts underneath them are many, many specific measures. If we had more time, I could go into great detail, because under each of the charts I'm showing you, there are 15 or 20 other charts measuring different aspects of economic equality or political polarization, and they all tell the same story, which is why it's convenient to just show you one chart. And in this case, economically, the data actually begin, the good hard data begin in 1913, because that's when the IRS was created, and that's when we begin to have really good data on income distribution in America. There is data, not quite so good data, but there is data going back earlier, and you can see America was very unequal. A big gap between rich and poor. This was called the Gilded Age. Historians call that the Gilded Age, because there was such a big gap between the rich folks on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and the poor folks, the poor immigrants, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Big gap, but as you see, in the first decade of the 20th century, that began to change, and there began to be a little more equality of income. Still very unequal, but we're moving in the right direction. At least there was a pause during the 1920s. That's the go-go decade of the 1920s, in which the stock market did really well, and it helped rich folks and hurt poor folks. But then, even before that stock market boom ended, we began to become more equal. And as you see, during the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, of course, part of that was the New Deal, but it was going on before the New Deal, and it kept on going after the New Deal. More and more, a narrower and narrower gap between rich folks and poor folks. And that reaches its peak roughly in the 1960s. America was not a purely equal society. We didn't have a communist distribution of income, of course, but at that time, we were about as equal. The American looked statistically a lot like Scandinavia, actually. That is very, very low gap, a very modest gap between the incomes of the people at the top and the incomes of the people at the bottom. But then, as you see, and now this looks a little familiar, beginning in the 70s and into the 80s, and then plunging during the 1980s and 1990s, and all the way to where we are now, much increasing gap between rich and poor. And again, if we showed you the data up to really right now, 2021, the curve would be down in the lower right-hand corner, way down there, about as unequal as America's distribution of income has ever been. And that U curve, that inverted U curve, just sort of as we saw in the case of politics, shows that we've moved over this 125 years from a position of great inequality to a position of remarkable equality, and then back down to really very low levels of equality, high levels of inequality. Next slide, please. This shows the same trend. Here we're looking at measures of social cohesion, that is the degree to which Americans connect with one another, with their family and with their neighbors and with their community, and get involved in community organizations and so on. And that at the beginning, at the end of the 19th century, in the 1890s, Americans were very socially isolated. Shaylyn we'll have a time in a moment to tell you what that looked like on the ground. But Americans were, and the data all show this, very socially isolated. But then beginning in the early years of the 20th century, as you can see, that began to change, and people began to join more organizations, and they got married earlier, and they were more likely to have kids. And there's that pause in the 20s, but through the 20s and 30s and 40s and into the 50s and up to the 60s, more and more people were connecting with one another. They were connecting, well, first of all, they were marrying more and having more kids. That's the baby boom. But they were also joining organizations more, joining PTAs, trusting their neighbors, a lot of social cohesion in that period, or what I sometimes call social capital. But then again, in the second half of the 60s, that the worm turns and we begin to move back in the other direction. Every year, less and less social cohesion, less and less trust in other people, less and less connections with other people, families beginning to disintegrate, and so on. And again, by now we're back almost to the level of social isolation and social disintegration that we saw 125 years ago. Let's quickly see the next slide. Here we're going to be looking at culture. This is the degree to which people feel that we're all in this together. The sense that we're a kind of a community of a we, so to speak. And that was very low. And again, Shaylyn will have a chance to tell you a little bit more about what this felt like in the late years of the 19th century. But Americans were very focused on self-interest in that period. But then beginning around 1900, once again, that began to shift. A little more focus, year by year, a little more focus on what we have in common, and a little less focus on self-interest. And that in that change, again, there's this pause in the 20s, but rose steadily, more and more emphasis on what we have in common, less and less emphasis until the middle 60s. In the middle 60s, there's a lot of emphasis on what we're sharing with what we share with one another. And even in that period, that it's not an accident that that's when the civil rights movement occurs, because we had been gradually becoming more inclusive in our sense of we. And we'll have a lot more to say about race later. But that was a period, the beginning, at the middle of the 60s, a period in which Americans looked like we were, finally becoming a we, a more comprehensive we, not just a we that was white and male, but a more general we. But then, and we'll have more to say about that, again, the curve turned and we began to become more self-interested, more focused on our own self-interest, more focused on I and less focused on the we. And again, that trend continues to this very day. Now, let's look quickly. Let's put all those slides. If we have the next slide, all those together, you can see I've shown here each of those separate, the economics and the politics and the society and the culture, but they're all the same curve essentially. And that means we can put them all together for simplicity's sake into one curve. The next slide. If we have the next, there we are. And this is the slide that is at the core of our book. It shows that over the last 125 years, America has moved from what we have come to call an I society, down there in the late 19th century, a society that was remember, it's unequal, it's polarized politically, it's socially isolated, and it's culturally focused on self-centered. And that's very, very much an I society. In the middle of this period, in the 1960s, America had become much more equal economically, much more cooperative politically, much more connected with one another socially, and much more focused on what we have in common and not what we share. Of course, there's a question to be asked, and we're going to ask it. Well, what did that we mean? How did we define we in that period? But in any event, you see that after that period, we began to become we went down the curve, steadily less equal economically, steadily more polarized, steadily more socially isolated, steadily more I focused. Shaylyn, what does all this mean? That is, what did it look like in real life, not just statistics, and what can we learn from it?
Sure. Thanks, Bob. And I just want to say it's great to be back in Minnesota. Virtually, I lived in Minnesota for a couple of years, and so lived in the Twin Cities. And so it's really fun to be back. So let me just say that. But I want to just pick up where Bob left off here with something that one of the reviewers of our book said. It said that our book was a nice addition to the Why America is in Such a Mess genre of books, which I think is, a real truth. Over the past 10 years, there have been a lot of studies of how it is that we've gotten into this multifaceted crisis, which is, where Bob started the presentation. And a lot of those books focus on maybe one aspect of this crisis, whether it's the economic inequality or perhaps the political polarization, and asking how we got to that degree of inequality or that degree of polarization. But rarely, I think, have studies looked at all of these different phenomena together and asked the question of whether there was something bigger going on here. And so we think that that's one important contribution of this particular data discovery, which of course is Bob is entirely responsible for that. This discovery of all of this confluence of different trends. But the other really fascinating thing I think about the contribution of this research is that it indicates very clearly that we have been in a mess remarkably similar to the one that we're in now once before. So if you're looking at that curve in front of you, you can see where we are today is roughly the same place statistically that we were at the turn of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 1900s. And so the lesson here from our perspective is not just a doom and gloom message of everything is getting worse and worse, and also not a message about let's look back to some supposed golden age when we were at the peak of this curve and figure out how to reinvent that America. On the contrary, our message here is if ever there were a historical moment whose lessons we need to learn, it's the lesson when, as a nation, we moved from I to we. We moved from a situation so similar to the one that we're in today and turned things around and entered a multifaceted upswing that lasted for decades. We successfully weathered this storm once before. We believe that we can do it again. And the question then becomes, what are the lessons from that moment in history when a determined group of reformers righted the ship? So if we could just go to the next slide, I'm just going to give you a few of these lessons from the progressive era. So Bob talked about the Gilded Age, which was this deeply unequal, deeply polarized moment in the late 1800s. And that slowly gave way to something called the progressive era, which was this moment of reform when many different reforms were put into place that played out as we watch that curve unfold over that 70-year period. But I want to just pause for a second and make sure that we're clear that when we use the term progressive in this historical sense, we're not using it in the same way that it's used today. Today, you might hear a lot about progressivism, and we might call that small p progressivism. And that refers, of course, to the leftmost end of the political spectrum. However, when we're talking about the progressivism of this past period, we're talking about capital P progressivism, which is a historical movement that was actually bipartisan. It was not just coming from the left. And it was a movement that historians have called so diverse as to be barely coherent. There were a lot of different competing factions within this movement. It was a group of people who were determined to right the ship, but didn't always agree about how they were going to do it. And so what united this movement into an actual movement? Well, it was people who had a compelling desire to repudiate that downward drift of our nation and a galvanizing belief in the power of ordinary citizens to participate in that process and to turn things around. So what were some of the lessons of what these progressive reformers did? Well, as Bob indicated, this study is incredibly data driven. So you've seen all these different graphs, and the graphs that you saw are actually compendium measures or sort of compilation measures of scores of different other measures underneath them all. So we're looking at scores and scores of different measurable phenomena here to produce the graphs that he presented to you. So when you have a story like that, that's so data driven, that's so statistical, a lot of times you get the question, well, could we identify what was the leading indicator? What that means is when a trend starts to move in a new direction, things start to move upward, and you have all different sorts of phenomena moving roughly at the same time. Well, if you could identify which of them started to turn in the upward direction first, then maybe you would know what your leading indicator is, or that might be a silver bullet where if we focused on that one thing, maybe that's the thing that drives all of the other positive change. So a lot of times when people look at this data, they think, well, certainly it was economics. I think we have a kind of a bias in social science and maybe in America more broadly that economics drives everything, right? And so the assumption is that back in the progressive era, that the reformers focused on fixing economic inequality first. And once they did that, then our cultural solidarity came together and then we were more able to cooperate and all these things came in the wake of economic equality. That actually turns out not to be true. So the first lesson of this period is actually that economic equality was a lagging variable, meaning that it was one of the last things to turn. And that's not in any way to say that it's not important to work on the problem of economic inequality. It's one of the defining problems of our time and one of the most urgent problems for America. However, what the data shows from the last upswing is that there may be other drivers underneath that we need to get going in the right direction first. So if we know that economics is a lagging indicator, then what would be the leading indicator? What can we see in the data that might show us what is the leading indicator? it's a little bit hard to tell, right? Because as I said, there's so many different phenomena that we're looking at here. And we like to sort of liken this to watching a flock of birds in flight. If you've ever watched a flock of geese or something like that, you'll know that all of a sudden the birds will change direction. And you're looking at it going, which one changed? Who was the leader that they were all following? It's a little bit hard to tell, right? And that's a little bit similar to what we're looking at here with all these different measures and all this different data that turn in the same direction roughly at the same moment. That being said, however, it appears when we pair the data with the historical record that what actually changed first was culture, and not just culture, but morality. We often say that this period in American history was defined by a moral awakening. Now, what do we mean by that? The culture of the Gilded Age was really defined by something called social Darwinism. So at the time, Charles Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest as describing the natural world was a relatively new concept. And people began saying, well, hey, if survival of the fittest is how the natural world is organized, maybe that's how we should organize society. That makes sense, right? And so there was a lot of advocacy for this deeply competitive sort of only the strong will survive and the devil take the hindmost kind of mentality that really permeated American culture at the time. And into that cultural moment, there came a movement called the social gospel. The social gospel came out of evangelical Protestantism, and it was a movement that really began to question this cultural conception about society being one giant competition. These evangelical ministers, many of them were preachers, looked to the Gospels, looked to scripture, Christian scripture, and said, we don't think that this is what Jesus was teaching. He was teaching that society is about taking care of the most vulnerable, about what we owe to one another, an emphasis on responsibilities, not just rights. And so these social gospelers began to transform the cultural conversation to ask people to begin to prioritize responsibilities over rights, to prioritize the needs of others over the needs of the self. And this began in Christianity and in religiosity, and it began to permeate more broadly in the culture. And this really was a moment in which we were not only just questioning, what other people were doing. It wasn't just moral indignation directed outward. Identifying the bad apples in society and saying, if we could just get rid of those people, then we'll be a much more moral and righteous society. On the contrary, the historian Richard Hofstadter has said that these reformers, the progressive reformers, were characterized by a unique sense of moral indignation directed inward. They were shining the light into the dark parts of society, but also shining a light into the dark parts of themselves and asking how they had been complicit in creating this deeply unequal, deeply polarized, deeply culturally narcissistic moment. And so this was a moment that was characterized by what I like to call chastened elites who realized that it was their privilege that was the problem. And they began to transform the way that they interacted in the world and the things that they were advocating for politically and programmatically in order to see this large scale change. So those are a couple of lessons that we may need today, not to just focus on economic policy, but also to be focusing on the moral and cultural rethinking of our deepest and most foundational values in order to fuel another upswing today. Another way that this upswing is going to be fueled, as it was in the past, is by young people. The progressive era, the progressive movement of the early 1900s was deeply youth-driven. Oftentimes we think of some of the heroes of the progressive era, like Jane Addams, who received the Nobel Peace Prize for her work when she was late in years. But she was doing her most vital and important work to begin this upswing when she was under the age of 30, as were most of her counterparts. And so to a large extent, we believe that today America's fate lies in the hands of the post-boomer generations, that it's going to be a youth-driven movement. And essentially, these young people in the progressive era were facing a world that was completely different from the one that their parents had lived in. They had gone through the Industrial Revolution, and in a sense, their lives were sort of unrecognizable to the generations that had gone before, which I think feels a little familiar today when we're talking about sort of the digital natives that our young people are today. And we believe that with that changed worldview of living in a deeply changed world, they're more equipped to be innovative about what the solutions are that are going to ignite this upswing. Another lesson here from the last upswing was that the progressives were really focused on something they called association. So that's a little bit of an antiquated term. Today we might use a term like community or relationship or connection, but essentially they believed in the power of bringing people together. They believed in the power of conversation, of face-to-face ties, of social capital, to use Bob's term for this. And again, these were young people who were living in a deeply lonely and isolated time. They had moved largely out of the small towns and farms of the previous generation and into the busy, bustling, anonymous cities of the Industrial Revolution. And they were feeling the sting of loneliness. They were feeling that the associations of a bygone era just wouldn't fit in this modern world. And so they were inventing new ways to bring people together. And they were also focusing on bringing people together across lines of difference, particularly across lines of class difference. And this created vast new stores of social capital that really fueled the upswing for decades. So when I have on this slide the phrase association as an end and a means, what I mean by that is people were seeking association just because they were lonely and isolated. But then as a means, they realized the power of bringing people together as a means for bringing about change and creating coalitions and creating that powerful connectedness that really drove these reform movements. Um, Another lesson here was that this was a very grassroots movement. Again, a common misconception about the progressive era is that it was just characterized by big national programs. We often think of trust busting and child labor legislation and all these big sort of national changes. There were three constitutional amendments passed during this period, which was an extraordinary burst of changes to the Constitution. So we often think of the progressive era as being this kind of top-down reform program. But the reality is that those top-down measures came as a result of building on the work that had been done at the grassroots for decades. Mostly the progressive reformers were working right outside their own doorstep, at the level of the tenement, at the level of the neighborhood, at the level of the municipality. And these were what the progressive Louis Brandeis called the laboratories of democracy. They were the places where people were experimenting with innovative solutions that could really transcend the partisan gridlock of the time and show success and then be adopted more widely. And that's really what happened over time. There's some really fascinating examples of this that we detail in the book. So eventually that top-down legislation met the grassroots innovation, but the real driver of the change at the beginning of this movement was at the grassroots, which of course is a really important message to emphasize for our audience today who are working in community foundations at the level of the local community. The work that you are doing is the vital work that will drive our nation forward as it was in this bygone era. Another lesson here was simply that there was no charismatic political leader that was leading this progressive movement. Again, it was a sort of motley coalition of different groups in America, and the sort of Teddy Roosevelts that we think of as leading the progressive era, they really came along later. They saw a parade and got out in front of it. They were not someone who came along and laid out a grand national program that everyone got behind. So today, waiting for some national leader to pull us all in the right direction, we don't think is going to be the solution for America. We think that this is going to be a much more vitally local movement that then will be met with the national reforms as we can show what's working on the ground. So those are some positive lessons from the progressive era, but of course they're not all positive lessons. And in the book, we detail several cautionary tales that actually come out of this progressive era and out of this last upswing. And there's just one that I want to emphasize today, and that is that the we that these progressives were building toward, were orienting around, was certainly not inclusive enough. It was not a we that extended to people of color. To a certain extent, it was not a we that extended to women. And in a sense, that became part of why that upswing turned into a downturn. We can maybe get into the details of that a little bit more later, but in a sense, the fact that the progressives were largely racist, were not interested in dealing with the need for racial reconciliation, but instead sort of kicked that down the road for future generations to deal with. What that meant was that this upswing that brought America closer to realizing its ideals than it had ever been before had knit into it sort of the seeds of its own demise. And so any program that we would hope to participate in today to bring about an upswing, any way in which we would want to work toward that positive change, has to put full inclusion at the absolute center of the work. Equity and full inclusion has got to be the #1 priority if we are going to enter another upswing that doesn't reverse itself down the road because we haven't done the underlying work of racial reconciliation in this country. So those are some of the quick lessons from this period that we think are really applicable today. And if we could just go to the next slide, I'll leave you with just one parting thought. This is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and we think it really encapsulates what the message of this new sort of lens on the 20th century that we're trying to provide through this research. President Roosevelt said, the fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together. Whether we recognize the power of we, whether we lean into it or not, this is the American story, that we will go up or down together. We believe that America's I century really demonstrates this in high relief. And if we can rediscover again the power of we don't think that there's a limit to how close we can come yet again to realizing America's fundamental ideals. And so we hope that these provide some inspirations and sort of a broader lens on history to give some context to the very important work that you are all doing in your communities. This is incredibly important work that you're doing at the local level in those laboratories of democracy. And the historical record shows that that was an incredibly important part of the change that happened 120 years ago. So thank you so much for giving us some time to share this message. And we really look forward to digging into some questions to see how we can apply this to the work and the experiences that you're having on the ground.
Carol, you're muted.
I apologize. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob and Shaylyn, for giving us a synopsis of the history. One of the first questions has to do with what the impact of our race issues have had over this last 100 years.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I might just jump in and answer this. I think that the biggest question that we get, and rightly so, about this research is, well, you can't talk about we, and you can't talk about this we decades in America without talking about race, especially because this period that we were supposedly building toward a stronger and stronger we corresponded with Jim Crow and violent racial exclusion. So how do these two stories square? How is it that America could have been moving toward a greater and greater we, but at the same time being engaged in deeply exclusionary cultural practices and policies? And so that's a really important question. And again, I think there's so much to say about race today. Of course, it's urgent, especially for this audience, but for all of America. But again, we want to zoom out and give you the bigger picture here. So if I might, I'm just going to go over what kind of the shape of trends toward toward racial equality have looked like over this same period that we're discussing. So if we could, I actually have one more slide that maybe if we could pop that PowerPoint back up one more time. There's a graph here that I want to share with you. So we've shown you a lot of graphs that most of them look like this inverted U curve, or sort of like a rainbow. Things got better and better and better. And then roughly in the 1960s, 70s, they turned and got worse and worse and worse. So this is a graph that tracks relative progress between the races, between white and Black Americans over the same period that we're looking at for the entire book. Now, I want to just pause to say this is about Black-white equality, and the reason for that is not because the stories and contours of other peoples of color are not important. Of course not. The reason for this being a Black-white comparison is simply because over this full period, there's only data for Black Americans versus white Americans. We don't have data over the full period for Latinos or for Native peoples or other groups that we would be concerned about. And so it's really hard for us to draw conclusions when we don't have data over the full period. So that's the reason here that we're only talking about Black versus white Americans. Now, I want to just say that as the 19th century opened, the outlook for African Americans was extraordinarily bleak. There had been huge progress in the wake of Reconstruction that was violently ripped back by the sort of reclaiming of white hegemony in the South called redemption. And so African Americans at the very beginning of the 20th century had essentially had a lot of gains and then a ton of losses, and were in a very difficult situation. But the question is, then what happened? I think there's a lot of assumption, particularly among white Americans, that basically the 20th century, there was flat progress. There was no progress toward equality and inclusion over the first 2/3 of the 20th century until sort of the lightning bolt of Martin Luther King and the civil rights legislation, which changed everything. That's kind of a common misconception about what this century looked like. Now, it's not entirely a misconception, of course, because on some measures, particularly those that are about inclusion, that is what the graph looks like. Instead of looking like an inverted U curve, it looks like a hockey stick, flat progress and then dramatic progress when we get to the 1960s. So that's true of things like the longstanding lack of political representation for Black Americans. That's true of the longstanding delay to entering professional schools and professions. That's true to a certain extent of residential segregation. So there are measures that look like that, very flat progress until we get to the Civil Rights Revolution. But what was surprising to us when we looked at all of the data was that when you look at the progress of Black and white Americans when it comes to material equality, the shape of the graph looks quite different. So the graph that you're looking at is that graph of the summary index of Black-white material equality. So on that x-axis, you see again that same time period, roughly from the late 1800s to today. But then on the y-axis, you see that this goes up to 1.0, representing full equality between the races. So you can see that at no point over this period have we come anywhere close to full equality between Black and white Americans on material measures. And what I mean by that are things like life expectancy, education, earnings per worker, measures of wealth, home ownership. This measure even includes things like voter registration and voter participation. So how equal were we on all these different things? Well, we've never been equal, and progress certainly has never been fast enough. But what's surprising here is that when you look at this graph, most of the progress toward material equality actually took place before the Civil Rights Movement. So this was a surprise to us. I think it's a surprise to a lot of white Americans that actually we have this idea that all of the progress took place after the Civil Rights Movement. But on the contrary, it took place before. And then if you can put the pointer there right in roughly 1970, what you see is when we had this upward movement before the Civil Rights Movement toward material equality, when the Civil Rights Acts passed and sort of the de jure segregation was broken down, you would have expected that would have accelerated up even higher. But on the contrary, it entered a period of stagnation. And on some of the underlying measures here, it wasn't just stagnation of progress, it was a reversal of progress. So for example, Black homeownership today is lower than it was in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act passed. Black enrollment in college is lower than it was in the 1970s. So instead of having all of this grand progress in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, on the contrary, we've had what we call in the book a foot off the gas period, and in some cases, a reversal of progress. So when we're looking at the Black Lives Matter protests, those are certainly about police brutality and police violence and the over-policing of Black communities. But I think it's really important to understand that it's also about this period of stagnation that you are seeing on the graph, a half century of stagnation in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, in which there has been essentially no material progress for Black communities. There's extraordinary and explosive frustration in these communities for essentially the fact that the Civil Rights Movement did not make good on its promise, at least in these material ways. It certainly did in ways of inclusion, but not in these very fundamental, important ways that have to do with the day-to-day lives of Black Americans. And so that's one of the lessons of this story, to help us understand kind of what's behind some of the explosive feeling around equity in America today. But I think also another lesson is that it's interesting to note that the moment America took its foot off the gas was the same moment that we flipped from we back to I. And so whether whether that broader cultural turn toward I and toward individualism caused this stagnation or not, that's really difficult to say, but we certainly know that it corresponded here to the moment that America turned more inward and sort of essentially gave up on the progress, on the promise of we. And so that's just a little bit of an overview of what we want people to understand when we're looking at some of the conversations about race and equality today.
Great, thank you. We do have a couple of questions yet from the audience. Did we see anything in the past upswing that's similar to QAnon?
Well, not exactly, of course. I mean, part of that is that QAnon feeds on the anonymity that's allowed by the internet and by social media. But there have been, I would say fairly often in American history, very not just, well, anti-Semitic too, but very anti-foreigner, ethnocentric, violent reactions. One notable one, for example, is a movement called the Know Nothing movement, which was in the 19th century. They were called the Know Nothing movement because when they were asked about the activities of this, it was it was also anti-Italian and anti-Irish and anti-everything different. They said, I know nothing. And that is actually a very similar, and there were similar movements exactly at the period at the beginning of the period we're talking about. That is the period between roughly speaking, 1880, 1890 and 1910. I want to say two things. In one sense, there's nothing new. This is a very common reaction, actually not just uniquely American, but it is a common feature of American society and some other societies. There's a very sharp negative reaction to in the short run to the presence of the newly arrived presence of foreigners. Can I just take occasion also to say, underline a couple of things that we may have gone by a little too quickly, that's relevant to your audience. We talked about the progressive movement, and the progressive movement began in the upper Midwest. Indeed, there's a strong case for saying the progressive movement began in small towns in Minnesota. You know any small towns in Minnesota, small and medium-sized towns in Minnesota? That's where this movement began. And there are traces of it, actually. You know the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. What are the roots of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party? That was a new progressive party. I mean, it was obviously a merger of the Democratic Party and the Farmer Labor Party. But where did the Farmer Labor Party come from? That was the progressive party in the progressive era. It was founded, I think, in 1918, if I'm not mistaken. So you have all around you the signs, if you look for them, that it was people just like, I'm trying to speak to the people listening in and your fellow citizens, it was people just like you who turned this around the last time. And community foundations were one of the instruments they created. The community foundations, the first community foundation, I think, was created about in 1920, roughly speaking, 1918, 1920, 1921. I think Cleveland was where the first community foundation was. And that was founded in 1920, something like that. Community foundations, I don't mean your individual community foundations, you've been founded in different periods, but the idea of a community foundation was not just accidental. It was part of the way in which people in that period chose to try to combat the evils that they were facing, which are so similar to the evils you're facing, the partisanship and the inequality and so on. Sorry, I had to get that off my chest because one of the reasons that Shaylyn and I are delighted to be speaking to this audience is because it was people just like you who fixed the problem in the last, or at least put the whole country on the right track. And I'm hoping you'll come through this time.
That's great. So what gives you hope that the progressive or that the conservative movement will move away from this we versus me attitude and join us in the upswing? How do we convert them?
Yeah, this issue of hope or optimism. I think both of us are actually hopeful, at least. And Shaylyn, I'm going to let you start because we both have views about this. Why don't you start off? Why should we have hope, or should we have hope?
So the question specifically was whether we have hope that the conservative movement will turn in this direction, and that's a tougher question. So I might just duck that a little bit and talk a little bit about what gives us hope more broadly, if that's okay. One of the things that gives me hope is actually the beginnings of seeing moral language around our problems. Again, one of the clear lessons of the progressive movement was that there was a moral awakening, a cultural reimagining of what America was about at the beginning of this movement. And so when I look at the Black Lives Matter movement, and when I look at the Me Too movement, and when I look at the climate change movement, as articulated by someone like Greta Thunberg, these movements led by young people, again, who are not shy about putting moral language around the problems that we are facing. These are not just economic problems. These are not just technocratic problems. These are not just policy problems or political problems. These are moral issues about the foundational assumptions about what America is about. And so I think that that's really important. I love the Black Lives Matter movement for that reason. It's not just saying, hey, we need economic equality, or hey, treat us fairly, right? It's about igniting a conversation about the core values of America. So the more people that are willing to walk into that conversation and do that work, which is, I think, what Tanya Allen was calling for in the opening plenary, which if any of you missed that, her comments were so powerful on this regard. Voices like hers who are standing up and saying, this is about doing the inner work, America. Stop putting it off. Those are the voices that give me hope, because that, I think, is the proper framing of the challenge that lays ahead of us. Now, how we're going to get the conservatives into that fold is trickier. However, my Senator Mitt Romney, I live in Utah, and my Senator Mitt Romney is an example of one who I think is beginning to feel a dissonance between his moral and religious values and the political values of his party. And the more voices, I think, again, chastened elites, right? Coming, as I mentioned, that were a characteristic of this previous period, coming forward and saying enough is enough. And we just had, I think, I can't remember how many it was, national Republican leaders sign on saying, if there isn't change, we're going to create a new party. I mean, these are the types of things that happened in the previous era that I think are hopeful signs as far as getting down to the very roots of what we're needing to change here.
Let me add a little bit. Thank you. I mean, of course, I agree with what Shaylyn said, and especially about the importance of having a moral conversation, not just a policy conversation. But it's useful to go back to that earlier period. First of all, remember, Shaylyn and I are historians, at least for these purposes, and we look upon change measured in decades, not measured in weeks. So you don't come to us if you want to know what's going to happen tomorrow with respect to the Republican Party, or even what's going to happen to the Republican Party 6 weeks from now. That's not our specialty. However, I do want to focus back. I do want to call your attention to what was happening, which happened 125 years ago, when parties were split. That's exactly what was happening in that period, precisely, and including the Republican Party was being split. Exactly. Not the issues were not exactly the same. Actually, some of them were the same, but. And I think Steve referred earlier on to this vote that was just yesterday in the House of Representatives on this idea of having a bipartisan commission to investigate the events of January 6th. It's just this morning's news, but I think there were 35 Republicans who joined. Now that was not enough, and so all the headlines are Republicans are going to block this joint investigation of the invasion of the Capitol. But actually, 35 Republicans is a significant amount. That fracturing, that little bit of fracturing, is what it looked like 125 years ago when the parties began to move. So in that sense, I am hopeful. Now, do I think that the vote on this or whether it passes the Senate, all that it's going to be important in the short run? Of course, it's going to be important. But in the but focusing on the long run, which is what we're doing, I'm actually hopeful, not only for that, but for other reasons too. I mean, the fact that there's a huge increase in youth engagement, there's no doubt about that. All the evidence is that there's been an enormous increase. The turnout in 2020 was as high as it's ever been in America since what year? 1912. That is, it's exactly what it looked like when we turned around before. So that doesn't prove it. We're on the way, that we've made this pivot and are going to be heading up in the right direction. But I think the signs are moving in the right direction. And forgive me, I want to make one last point here. This is not just a matter of either Shaylyn and me, Shaylyn and I, or the community foundation leaders who are taking part in this call, observing as abstract observers and saying, well, thumbs up, things are going in the right direction, or things down, thumbs down. The most important lesson from the progressive era, and we say this in the book, is in academic jargon, agency. But what that means is we can make a difference. We're not, the progressive folks, they could have thought of themselves as imprisoned by history. You know, they came into, they didn't cause this problem. It's just been going on forever and ever. And you know, well, just drift along the way life has been going. But instead, they chose to take action. And we can show you that their actions made a difference. It changed the trajectory of the economy. And so, and Shaylyn can say a lot more about this because she knows a lot about that period, actually. And about the importance. So what it sounds like I'm making a very academic point, agency, blah, blah, blah. I'm not, I'm saying, and I'm saying to the people listening to this call, this is not just for you and for me. It's not just a matter of history. Well, things going to go the right direction or the wrong direction now. History tells us we can make a difference. That's what happened. Indeed, that's the only thing that matters, is what choices people make. Shaylyn and I've got to get off my pulpit here and you come in and give a more balanced historical view.
Yeah, but again, I just think it's not just about what choices we make politically.
Yeah,
it's about the choices that we make morally. That is the fundamental thing that the progressives got clear on. And as a result, they were able to create a new culture and a new national conversation that began to drive things in a different direction. So this isn't just about voting. It just isn't just about advocacy. So if there are young people out there listening, I would say, help lead us in the inner work, the moral work that we need to do, the moral reimagining that we need to do as a society, not just the political advocacy and calls for economic equality. We need to get down to the foundations here. And there are good signs that we're getting there.
Do you have any recommendations for us as community foundations of ways that we can bring people together respectfully and with inclusivity?
Time is running out fast. Shaylyn, let me take a crack at that first, and then you can have the last word. I want you to have the last word because you're much more articulate than I am. I know a lot about community foundations. I have a huge regard for community foundations. They are exactly the kind of institution, exactly. We didn't make up this for speaking to you today. Our evidence shows that what you need, what America needs today for a pivot has got to begin at the grassroots by conversations across party lines among people who are concerned about solving the problems in their communities. That's the core idea. I'd love to, actually, I'm going to just take a second to give an example. And you know, Shaylyn, that I was not going to be able to resist this. One example of a grassroots innovation, the last time, that changed America and came from local communities in the Midwest, and that is the high school. For the high school, that is a school to which all kids in the town could come to for free, is invented for the first time in world history in some small towns in the Midwest in and around 1910, under the influence of this broader set of changes, cultural changes and so on that we're talking about. But it began at the grassroots. The high school did not come from Harvard, did not come from DC. It came from little towns, you know, I come from a little town in the Midwest, so I'm able to say little podunk towns where people wanted to solve their problem, and their problem was that their kids were not getting an adequate education for the coming, after the Industrial Revolution. They needed to have that education. And so they created this. That idea went viral. Within 20 years, every community in America had a high school coming from these little towns in the Midwest. And that idea turned out to be the most important policy change ever made in America I think in American history, because from that single invention, giving everybody in America a free 4 years of secondary school, most of American economic growth throughout the 20th century came from that one innovation made in small towns in the Midwest by people they didn't think they were changing America. They thought they were trying to help their kids. And it turned out they hit on the right idea. So there's a lot more to be said about community foundations and things that they should be doing, but I'm trying to get across, it was exactly people in places like those you live in today, dealing with problems just like problems you're dealing with today, who changed America. Shaylyn, you have the last word.
That's a really powerful thought to end on, but I would also just add, if you are not already engaged in convening conversations across lines of difference, that is absolutely something that community foundations are uniquely situated to be able to do well in their communities. So if you are not part of the national conversations movement or the dialogue movement that's happening all across the United States, from living room conversations on the West Coast to Braver Angels on the East Coast, who are providing tools and formats and all sorts of interesting ways to bring people together to talk to one another, to reestablish relationship, reestablish association, and through that association, reestablish a shared understanding of goals, and through that shared understanding of goals, begin to create solutions. If you're not already convening people across lines of difference, I would strongly encourage you to do that. There are great tools out there. Please become part of this movement. Community foundations are one of the fastest ways that we can get this into every corner of America.
Thank you so much, Bob and Shaylyn. I'm going to turn it over to Steve to wrap up.
Wow, what a great conversation. And Bob, Shaylyn, thank you so much for your inspiration and your hope. I guess I'm just sitting here with goosebumps because of the possibilities of all the people on the call here. We hope we can pull as community foundations in furthering the conversation, and which ultimately lead to action. So thank you so much. And we want to thank all of you who are online now, or maybe watching this later in the recording. We're just so fortunate that I guess the one thing coming out of COVID has been, it's been nice to connect virtually and still connect. It doesn't replace the in-person, but hopefully we'll continue to find ways to build those connections across the divides that exist. So thank you so much. And we will be continuing conversations. If people on the call still want to go to some of the breakout sessions, we have a couple of networking sessions left if you want to join us. I want to say a very, very special thank you to our sponsors who really helped us put this all together. But Akoya Go, our technology platform, as our premier sponsor, the Minnesota Initiative Funds, the Blandin Foundation, Minnesota Council on Foundation, and Data Marketing. Thank you so much for your sponsorship and helping support this conversation and this event today. Just a couple of reminders is that we do have resources on the web, and you will have access to all the recordings of all the sessions. If you go to the registrant portal, all the information is there. The username and password is on the screen. Also, we created the Idea Center a year or so ago as a place to put ideas and for people to share conversations. And many of the things from the conference have been put out there, and we encourage you to check that out. And if you have ideas or things that you want to carry forward in the conversations, please feel free to post ideacenter.communitygiving.org. And finally, we do invite your feedback. There will be a survey going out, but if you have any thoughts or ideas, please email us at info@communitygiving.org. We're always open to your thoughts and ideas. And we're already thinking that next year, we're planning for EmpowerCF 2022 2022. It's hard to say that and hard to imagine as 2022. Tentative dates are April 25th through the 28th. And once again, we truly appreciate you being with us and being a part of the EmpowerCF 2021. Thank you and have a great day.